inviting me. Can you? He doesn't want to do it? Yeah, no, it's not your space. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the moving target relates to the problem that we've got lots of different audiences, and those audiences come at this whole thing from lots of different perspectives, and that's why it's a moving target. That's why I use that as the sort of description of what we're talking about today. So first of all, we'll talk about who those target audiences might be, and then what do we get the best value for in terms of effort if you're going to bother with advocacy, bang for buck. And then an idea about mapping our stakeholders, this environment, and who are the ones that is worth putting the investment into in terms of outcome. Then looking at the messaging. So once you've worked out who you want to talk to, what do you need to say to them? And then reaching those people who can affect change. So while you might have somebody who is really keen and wants to listen to you, they may not be somebody who's in a position to make something happen. And the idea about practicing your arguments. Now, I've also made these slides available. They're in our repository, the university repository. I tweeted that link to the OpenConCam hashtag as well. So you can follow along if you like. Okay, so let's talk about identifying targets. So in an academic environment, we can run from undergraduates right through to the government. And all of these are potential targets for us. Obviously, some are more salient targets than others, and are more available targets than others. But when we did with the Office of Scholarly Communication, we had an away day about a year ago, and we said, what are our targets and how much effort are we putting into these? And these were what we identified. So undergraduates and PhDs are both levels of students. And then we have our postdoc / early career researchers cohort. And then the sort of more established researchers and principal investigators, which do overlap a bit with university administration. A lot of people in university administration are also principal investigators, but not all. Some are just administrators. And then we've got the funding bodies and we've got the government. So when you ask the question about bang for buck, it comes down effectively to who's paying your salary. So from where I'm standing, a lot of the team in the Office of Scholarly Communication are actually funded by money that is provided by the Research Councils UK. So in that instance, our bang for buck is for the Research Councils UK, because that's in terms of meeting their requirements. Unfortunately, we've got a requirement from HEFCE and a requirement from the Wellcome Trust as well that are slightly different as well, which is annoying. But they don't provide us with specific money to pay the staff, because they say we provide the university with lots of money, and the university should then flow that money down to the Office of Scholarly Communication, clearly not understanding at all how money works in the university. That doesn't happen. So we've got a duty of care to the people who we're looking after. Now, the university sees that the Office of Scholarly Communication is looking after all three of those: HEFCE, Wellcome Trust, and RCUK. So we've got to sort of think about our audiences there. And then we want to think about how receptive are these audiences and how productive, I'll talk about that in a minute, are these audiences, and how influential are they. So if we do a little grid, if we look at starting with undergraduates, the open access message, they're reasonably receptive. They are an environment, a group of people who understand the sharing culture. For them, that makes sense. But it is abstract. These are not people who are publishing work. There are a lot of undergraduates, which surprises me, but there are a lot of undergraduates who can actually finish their degree having not ever read a published paper. So it is quite abstract for them. So it's an in-principle thing, yep, that's great. But the bang for buck part of it is the vast majority of undergraduates do not end up in academia, do not end up people doing research and publishing. So bang for buck, nil. They're kind of like not relevant for us in some ways. When you get into the PhD students and the postdocs, these are the groups where we have the really greatest engagement. I'm putting a fair amount of money on it. A lot of people in this room probably fit into that category, right? So PhD students and postdocs, very receptive. They're new to this whole environment. They're wanting to understand how things work. And so when you start talking about the bigger picture, about what's involved, about the finances flow, about what you can do and how you can affect change, it's really exciting for them. But from the university's point of view, there's not great bang for buck, because PhD students, unfortunately, most of them don't end up having a job in academia, and a lot of people in the Office of Scholarly Communication are working in administration, having had PhDs from other areas. And so that means they're not publishing much. And then postdocs, while they publish work, REF is not until 2021. The likelihood of those postdocs still being here is pretty low. So you've got to think about that bang for buck as well. So just because they're receptive doesn't necessarily mean they're the people we should be spending lots of time on. If you want to take a purely fiscal view of this, PIs, principal investigators, I've written marginal as their level of interest in this. It's much lower than the early career researchers, and I'll talk about that, why I'm in the messaging part. But they really should be our primary focus because they are the ones who are producing most of the scholarly outputs. So they're the ones we need to make sure their outputs are compliant with various policies. Whether or not they want to hear that message is another question. Once we get to university administrators, if we get through, again, marginal interest, but if we get through, there's a big effect on the institution. These guys, being guys and girls, are the people that we want to really, really get hold of and try and talk to about these are the sorts of changes that we need to make at an institutional level. Similarly, funders, they have I've said mediumly receptive because some funders are right into this and some aren't. So it's on a case-by-case basis. But the kind of effect that funders have affects the whole sector. So once you've got administrators, that's at the institutional level, the funders are the sector level, and if you get in at the government, that's the whole country. So in Australia, there was a decision made now close to 10 years ago to invest, originally it was $47 million in, we need to do something about research data. Everybody fell off the chair. Nobody talked about research data. What? And so they've invested enormous amounts of money, and then there was a second big chunk of money, and now Australia's really, really ahead. There's a big database of all research data sets that you can go, and if it's open access, you can get to, otherwise you can request it from the authors and so on. The infrastructure is fantastic because the government made a decision that this mattered and invested some money in it. So you can see the different kind of effects depending on who you're talking to. So this is a useful exercise. This is something that I was at the Force Summer Institute that we had in San Diego earlier this year. And you can't see at the bottom, but there's a link just at the blacked out bit to all of the slides that we had and all of the resources that we used for we had a week-long course, 5 days each morning. We did this course, 14 hours of delivery. Me and Sarah Shreves from Miami University, she was fantastic to work with. And one of the things we did was a stakeholder map. We said, who are the stakeholders? And where are they coming from? And what kinds of things would they want to be hearing? And so one of the things that we, one example was, let's talk about researchers, and in this case, PIs. What are the incentives for them, and how can we demonstrate benefit to them? And so one good thing is to pick out the people who are already motivated. And then look at them and say, okay, what are their motivations? Is it a personal motivation or is it an external motivation? I'm doing this because I have to, for example. I'm doing this because it may include funding in the future. And then looking at the people who are not engaged and saying, well, does this apply? Is this something I can use for those researchers who are not interested? And then looking at the ones who are interested, is that because they don't know or because they're coming at this with a particular perspective? So this was the sort of analysis we did for each stakeholder. And what we ended up with was this document, and that's why you've got the links, because that's a long URL, but you can link through. It's linked through from the Google folder from the ISKI event, the one in San Diego, and it's also, that's the link that you should be able to see in the repository slides. But this goes on, and so it talks about the stakeholder name, what's important to them, how could they contribute to a project that you might have in open access or this area of open research. What kind of things, blocks could they create for the project, and so on, and where who can lead this, and it goes on into engagement suggestions. It goes on a bit beyond the screen. It's a very useful document. So now you've identified who you want to talk to. Let's talk about what you're going to say. So everyone comes into a discussion with a priori ideas. That is, they walk into the equation having already made up their mind about a situation. This is my experience, and therefore that is the way it is. And there was a very, enough time to tell this anecdote. When I was in Australia, I went to a presentation that was at the Powerhouse Museum. It's an interactive museum. And this bloke had done a whole lot of research on particular activities, and he filmed people without them knowing initially. He didn't tell them afterwards, and watched them interact with these exhibits. And then what he did was said, I'm not a creep, but I have been filming you without you knowing. Would you mind coming and watching your video of yourself and explaining what you were thinking, what was happening? And the ones, he showed us a couple of examples, and one was where you've got different metal plates. So if you put your hands on the right plates, you get you get a charge. And so he would say to people, what's happening here? And they'd say, I'm trying this and da 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 da. And then some people rubbing their hands together or blowing into their hands. And what are you doing there? I'm creating some static electricity. And you can see I get a bigger hit, even though the evidence was in front of them. They didn't get a bigger hit, but they thought they did. And even though they could see that in front of them they hadn't, they still thought that they did. Or I'm shaking all the energy down to my hands and I'm getting a larger response. And so what he was saying was that these sorts of exhibits don't necessarily teach people much about science, because people have walked in already having decided how electricity works, and doing that experiment is not necessarily going to change their mind. Now, a lot of people who designed those sorts of things were in the room. They got rather upset by this, but I felt that it doesn't really matter. They're doing science. They're having a go. They're trying something, seeing what happens. It doesn't really matter. Anyway, the point being, it's very hard to change somebody's mind. So if they've already decided on something, then you're up against it. So let's talk about how you do that. There's a lot of evidence now to say that the worst way of trying to tell somebody that something's wrong is repeating that. So for me to say, it's not true that the MMR vaccine is attached to autism. I've just reiterated the myth in your brain. Instead, you say, it's clear that the MMR vaccine is entirely safe for children and stops them from catching measles and dying. That's probably a better way of putting that forward. So putting a positive message forward, not repeating the myth. There's a lot of evidence that's come through about that one. Another thing is that facts can make an impression, but only if they fit into a kind of experience that somebody has already had. So if you're talking to somebody about, it's unsafe for you to keep lots of water around. In Australia, there's lots of drought. Water is a major problem. So it's not uncommon for people to say, save the bathwater and bucket the bathwater out into the garden, for example. Most people, and I'm quite serious, most people have a bucket of some description in the shower, because you catch the water as the cold water while it's warming up, and you take that out and you water the garden with it. So it's quite normal in Australia to do this sort of thing. But some people might leave the water in their bath for a long period of time. And that potentially is something that is a waterborne problem, waterborne disease problem. And so I know of a discussion between two people that I know, and one of them said to the other, this is very unsafe. There's risk with waterborne disease. You really need to make sure you empty the bath water out because it's dangerous for the kids. And I said, there's no point you saying that, because in their experience, these kids have grown up with these full baths of dirty water all their lives and have never caught a waterborne disease. So yes, on a population level, that may be true. In their personal experience, it's completely not true. So they're not listening to that argument. And that's an example of this idea about it's got to fit with their already experience, the experience they already have. And so one of the things is it might be better to do a narrative, sharing a story, than going fact, 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 fact. So these are just suggestions. The other question is who the messenger is. So who are you to be telling me this? It is not your place. What would you know? These sorts of things. It's very frustrating when that happens, especially when you think you do know, and you do think it's your place. But sometimes it might be better to understand that you're not necessarily the person in the position of power. That what you need to do is try and convince the person who is in the position of power to do the talking for you. So it's thinking about who the messenger is, the best person to do that. And that was one of the mapping outs that we did in this course in San Diego, was saying, well, how do we get, who's the decision maker, and how do we get to that decision maker? How does the governance flow? So understanding the power structure of an organisation, and that organisation can mean lots of things. It may be an individual lab group where you've got a leader of the lab who's very, very influential, and everything kind of goes up to that person, and they're the decision maker. That's fine. They're the person you need to try and get to. You talking to them might not be the way, but they might have the ear of so-and-so whose kid goes to school with their kid or something or other. And that's the person you need to talk to, so they can go and talk to them. It's this kind of roundabout way. It shouldn't be this way, but it is. If you're talking about the organisation like like a university, very complex organisations with very complex governance structures, it really does help to actually understand how that system works, what the committee structure might be, how you get something onto the agenda of a committee. And this is something we've struggled with here in Cambridge, because we have groups of early career researchers, postdocs, who have representation at these committees on the basis of their school. So the theory is that they can go to their head of school and say, could you talk about blah, blah at such and such a committee for me? But that head of school might just be going, or department might say, well, you're only one person, I'm not sure if this is really an issue that other people care about. Whereas collectively, there might be quite a lot of postdocs from lots of different disciplines who are all agree that this is a problem. And they currently don't have a means to actually be represented. This is something the university is aware of, and I think it's trying to do something about. But there is this problem about representation and being able to clue into it. So it really does help to understand your organisation. And so this is a question about your time and energy. About it's no point sort of, picketing out the Vice Chancellor's house or whatever if there's no notice is going to be taken of that. What you need to do is try and work out what's the best use of your time, what's the best way to try and make something happen without exhausting you and actually getting some effect. So this is a classic box. Lots of people have seen a version of this in the past. If you're thinking about various things that you might want to do, this is quite a good exercise. You can put them down on a piece of paper, stick down Post-it notes, and you can map them out against the issue about how much interest, this is a stakeholder map that we did, how much interest would somebody have in what we're trying to do, and how much influence do they have? So if you've got somebody who's relatively interested but has no influence, well, they're at the top here. But what you're really aiming for is people at the far corner. You want people who are interested and engaged and have influence. That's the best option. So it's a matter of sort of working that out. And as horrible as it sounds, really not worrying about people down in this bottom corner. Because those people aren't very interested, a lot of effort to get them involved. And even if they are involved, you might get them doing something, but that's not necessarily going to affect a lot of change. So this is, I think, I should have retired after this. This is probably the most influential, impactful thing I ever did, was this graphic. And ever since, it's just been a complete waste of time. So what we did was I sat down with a colleague and we just worked out what are the kind of main headline benefits of open access. And you can start looking around these options. You can start to see that these things are talking to different audiences. So issues about taxpayers getting value for money is not necessarily a very motivating thing for a researcher. That's not necessarily the reason why they're doing their research. It could be, but it's not going to be a primary one. It is a primary one for funders. So if you've got a funder that is funded themselves by taxpayers, they do want this return on investment. Compliant with grant rules is one that's like a stick that we can use, not necessarily liked by the research community, but it is something we say, well, you've got to do it. It's the last thing. You talk about all of the greater good stuff, blah, 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 and at the end you say, well, you have to, sorry, it's sort of, that's the way it is. Things like the public can access your findings, again, is more along the funder side of things, although some researchers see the value in that. But when you're talking to researchers, you're talking about practitioners can apply your findings, higher citation rates, your research can influence policy, ego, 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 you are wonderful, open access will make you famous, and rich for free. So depending on which person or stakeholder you're talking to is which kind of angle you take with your sort of messaging. And then you need to think about the arguments that you're using. Are you going to try and argue your case using things like facts and figures, which can work, especially for big ones, things like Stephen Hawking's thesis, where we have over 1 million individual IP addresses try to access the thesis in less than a week, hence we broke the internet. Is it the social good agenda? Appeal to the ego, promise you it does work. Or is it things like the money and the cost of publishing and how outrageous that might be, and this is an alternative way? These are all valid arguments. They're different to one another, and it might be more effective depending on who you're talking to. And you need to make sure you've got the information to back these claims. So one of the arguments is this is about reproducibility. And this is a discussion that we've had here at Cambridge with various people. And initially our conversations were about the greater good. That reproducibility is something that we're talking about, the concern we have for the validity and the veracity of the scientific record. And then particularly now under the politics that we've got going on in the US and so on, that science is really under threat. It's being really, really undermined. We don't need experts, what would they know? kind of thing. And of course, anything that comes up as being unreproducible or straight out false underlines that and supports the argument we don't need experts. So reproducibility is really quite implicitly quite important just for science in general. But it's also important in terms of ensuring that we have funding into the future and so on. Because obviously, if an area of research turns out to be completely made up and rubbish, it's not going to get funded into the future. So there's a whole lot of reasons that we would want reproducibility. But when you start talking about the sorts of issues and how poor this situation is, and hyper-authorship, and that people are effectively what's called harking, hypothesising after the results are known, or that there's peer hacking, or there's selective use of results and so on, that there is actually quite a serious problem. You can see the people, and this comes back to their own experience situation with Artwork. If they haven't experienced this, if they have not seen this in their own practice, it just sounds like rubbish. When you put it all together, it's so frightening. It's just like, you have to be making that up. It was the wrong way for us to try and approach this discussion. It was not the right way with that particular group of people. This guy, Marcus Manafo, is a researcher at University of Bristol. And this is a really, really excellent video. It's 36 minutes long. He gave it to Research Libraries UK a couple of years, last year. And he talks about scientific ecosystems of reproducibility. And he just has example after example after example of problems that have happened. He's very invested in this and does research in this area, as well as his regular scientific research. Who are you to say this? He's a real life researcher saying it. So he's a much stronger voice than, say, my voice. That's about finding the resources that can back you up. Now, you need to practice your argument. Okay, so this is something I found this morning, which is Martin Pauly is very active in the humanities and open access, and he put this together, and it's a sort of list of the arguments, counter-arguments, and political alignments for and against open access. And it pretty much covers off everything. So he's got the taxpayer argument, the moral and education argument, the labour argument, the technological argument, economic impact argument, the library economics argument, that's the subscription one, the epistemological argument, got that out without mistaking, and media argument. And so what he's got is, this is the argument for open access, and this is the counter argument that will come through. Because mostly every counter argument will fall into pretty much one of those categories. If you get familiar with this stuff, the best thing to do is just to listen to somebody say, because you can predict, you can say, I can tell you're going to say X, Y, and Z. That's very confrontational. Listen to what they've got to say, and then you go, I agree. And you'll probably find that such and such, whatever your argument is, your counter argument to that point. And the point being is, if you're trying to advocate, you need to have these already in their back pocket. You need to know that one of these is going to come out. And so one of the exercises that we did in this Summer Institute was, we got people who tend to be certain stakeholders, and then they have to write an argument. I disagree with this because it's going to be too expensive for the institution, or I don't have time, or whatever. And everyone screwed them up. I was going to do this today, we didn't have enough time. Everyone screwed them up and then threw them across the room. So you've got an argument. This is the Vice Chancellor saying this is too expensive for the institution, and you have 2 minutes to come up with a 1 minute response. And you have to be off the top of your head, make sense, just come out with your response, your 1 minute response. The lift idea, the lift pitch, elevator pitch thing, that you've only got a really short period of time to get your message across. So being prepared and having that just around really helps, because we've heard it all before. This is not new. I've been involved in this whole thing for 14 something years. We've all done it before. There's nothing new in this space. So, strategies for engaging senior leadership. This was a Birds of a Feather session that Nigel attended. And this article was written up by various people, and I've been one of them, and another colleague, Rosie Higley, plus others. It was a group of people that talked about what kind of work in this area. How can you convince senior management? And all the stuff that was said before, all the nice to haves doesn't work. And these are the things that they came up with, the sorts of things that work. That doomsday scenarios and risk to reputation is quite effective. You can have high profile cases of fraudulent research. We wouldn't want that to happen to us, would we? Asking people to self-reflect and imagine the situation of being asked for supporting research for a publication of theirs from some time ago. They even know where that is. The institutional mission statement, depending on what it is. Or horror stories of poor data management practice in your research community. That's really easy, unfortunately. It wouldn't take you much to find those. And also things like know your networks, the sort of stuff I've been talking about, use your allies. And so just to finish up, what we're hoping is it won't come to this. And if you want to, you can actually use this as an example. So this was a fire that happened last year, earlier this year, 28th of April, in Manchester Sierra, UK unit. And I mean, obviously it's just a disaster for everybody. All of their equipment was burnt and so on. But I've just pointed to this point here. We've almost certainly lost data where computers have been ruined. We're going to go in and salvage as much of that as possible. So the insurance is going to replace the machine. But the cost of reproducing that data, again, is phenomenal. It's a huge expense. And so this is a sort of example of why you need to have good data, research data management. So that's an example of a doomsday scenario. So your take-home message from here, from what I've been saying, it is a case of horses for courses. That is an expression used here in the UK? Yeah, okay, because I sometimes can still get caught out. So who's your audience and what is their motivation? And what are the arguments that are likely to stick for them? And there's a very useful resource, and related to it again, these are the links to all of the stuff that we did in that institute, that summer institute, that relate to that, mapping your stakeholders, understanding your institution, working out how to touch various people across your institution for advocacy. So that's all I have to say, but I'm happy to answer questions and I'll repeat them into the microphone.
Do I have a chance to speak as a early career researcher, but not that young anymore? Do I have a chance to see any of these benefits come to life? Or any of these changes towards a more open research that you presented, stakeholders that you need to approach, and different messages that obviously will take a lot of time to implement. So do I have the chance to see it?
Okay, sometimes, because I've been around for 14 years in this space. I started my PhD in 2004, so 13 years, coming up to 14 years, at the beginning of 2004. And sometimes I feel really positive about all of this because I think about where we were then and where we are now. And sometimes that's helpful. When you're looking forward, you just go, oh, this is just so slow. But if you look back and see where we were, so people didn't even know the word open access, what are you talking about? And now it's sort of policy, and now it's a requirement. And I still hear some people going, oh, it's just a fad. I'm thinking, are you, really? But you look at the kind of really big stuff that's happening out, the European Open Science Cloud, and there's all of the work that's happening in Europe that's just going straight towards this. And we look at, just in the last 18 months, the explosion in preprint servers, and so and the acceptance of various funding bodies like the NIH and the Wellcome Trust to say, yes, you can count things like preprints as your research output in your grant application. So putting validity and putting a price effectively on other forms of research output other than just your high-end publication in a fancy journal. So those things are really positive, and I think that there is a really strong momentum. I think that of all the stakeholders that were listed there, the biggest block actually are institutions, and there's a reason for that. So there was an article that came out about a month ago where it was somebody from a senior institution saying, you know, guys, we really need to pull ourselves up. It's actually up to us. Now, the tricky thing with institutions is that research is a global endeavour, and people within different disciplines kind of run in a disciplinary manner. So what you don't have is quite often, because of the nature of a teaching university, you don't have your colleagues sitting either side of you because there's a need to teach across the discipline. So it's quite likely most of your colleagues are actually somewhere else, and quite often international. So you have this group of people who is a virtual college, invisible college is the term. And so there's communication norms and so on that happen within that invisible college. These are quite different to the next one. And sometimes language is different because we want to make sure that we're not seen as the such and such group because we're the such and such group. So there's these sorts of nuances between groups. Yet, as an individual, you are across an institution, which actually cuts right through your discipline. And there are rules that happen at institutional level and at funder level, but it's just like, there's no horses for courses, this is it. You've all got to do this thing. And everyone gets annoyed about it. So if an institution says, okay, I'm going to try and do something different, what they're doing is they're pulling, it becomes a three-dimensional thing. It's not this way. There's a third dimension, which is we're taking this particular cohort of people and we're trying something different that's out of keeping, both with the funder requirements and the institution requirements and with their discipline. And that's really risky, because obviously the funding source for the institution is dependent on the researchers being successful, and then they're dependent on doing the thing that is valued by the funding bodies or the et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's really tricky for them to step out as one institution. And that's why they're the slowest to move. It's understandable. So I think that the area that has the most influence and can make things happen really are the funders, because everyone then has to do it. Like, it would be lovely if everybody did it because they wanted to do it. They're not going to. So if the funders say you have to do it, it's sort of like you start doing it and you go, actually, this works quite well. And it's quite nice that I can find all of my stuff and I don't have to dig out an old computer from out the back of the cupboard that still has those files on, and I can just find them online. Well, it's nice that I can see the number of downloads of my work, or I can follow the blogs through Altmetric or whatever. You start to see that this is a valuable way of working. So I do think that the fact that we've got this really strong push from funders and it's getting stronger, that's really the great white hope in terms of what might actually affect proper change. So I'm hoping to say, you're not that old, Lauren, that yes, you must see change. Any other questions?
Sorry, I'm keeping us from lunch, which is interesting. You had about sort of maybe halfway through, maybe near the beginning, you had a grid of influence and I can't remember what the other perhaps it was, impact. Sorry, isn't that the same? No, sorry, it was like a 4x4. It was mapping out who you should target. This one, interest and influence. So what worried me when you were presenting this is that first-year PhD students, I think, would potentially fall in that bottom left corner. And I've always thought that first-year PhD students are sort of the most important people to target, because that's the sort of the generational change that. So I wonder if maybe you can either alleviate my concerns by remapping it on there.
I wouldn't put them in that box. I'd put their interest quite high, actually, because they do want to know how stuff works. That's why they're starting to do a PhD. They want to know whatever it is that they're investigating, how that works and about it. But if you give students, early PhD students who have done this, talks about how the big system works and what a university kind of is and where the money comes from and how you get to that money and what matters. It's like, oh, we are. Sort of suddenly you can see there's sort of understanding that this is not a school. This is a different environment. They're working in a whole different world, and I think they are quite interested. In terms of influence, yes, they are the next wave, and that's why I disagree with when we look at this. Depends on where you're coming from, and perspectives differ, right? Talking bang for buck from who's funding us to do this work is not the same answer I would give in terms of bang for buck in terms of actually affecting change in the longer term. In the longer term, we need the PhD students and the postdocs, because what we've got is the people who are established in their behaviours and they're not necessarily going to change. They're the ones with power right now. You might say, and I do say this sometimes to students, say, you'll go back to your supervisor who will tell you this is a whole lot of rubbish, and all you need to do is publish in Nature and you'll be set for life. And that's it. And to some extent, they're right, I suppose. That was sort of, but that's the way it was for me. So therefore, it's the way it is now. Whereas if we start really investing in these early career researchers, then we can start affecting change. But the problem is, of course, that they aren't valuable to the institution at the moment. And what we have to hope is that we are all institutions doing this, so that when we inherit PhD students from somewhere else, or an early career researcher from somewhere else, they also have gone through the process. We have to kind of trust that we're all kind of in this together and we're doing this collectively for a greater community. So that's the justification we use in terms of our costs. So I would not put them in that bottom corner. I would say that they're interested, but at the moment, they're not. Does that alleviate any of it? Okay, good. Any other questions? Yep, I'm going to have to repeat yours. I can't remember. So I'll take you, Karen. Yes, thank you.
I was wondering how useful you find using this kind of open access. I find it's one of those terms a bit like feminism, you know, say like I'm going to talk to you about open access feminism. People kind of shut down in that kind of, oh great, I'm going to have that rammed down my throat again. Is it useful as a term? Or
okay, so the question is about the sort of politics and the usefulness of the actual term open access and whether or not it's a negative or not for things online. Okay, so yeah, I agree. And particularly here where, and possibly at other institutions, but I was quite shocked when I first started here because open access was code for compliance. And my understanding was before my time that open access website, one of the words that they were actually going to call it www.compliance.cam.ac.uk. I mean, it was really, really code for compliance. And so there is that negative association, or we just have to do this. So we definitely avoid talking about open data. That's really frightening to people and scary. So we talk about things like research data management or managing your data effectively. If we put open access in the title of something, people don't turn up. So things like managing your online presence, ensuring your research is seen by the world, these kinds of language is helpful. And you say, oh, by the way, this is called open access halfway through the talk, because by then they're engaged. But yes, I agree, open access is somewhat of a swear word and a bit difficult. I mean, it is what it is. And this is the other problem, is that there's a lot of language that's been appropriated in this discussion. And so it's not even 100% clear to people what green open access and gold open access is. And so the publishing industry has been trying to tell everybody that gold open access is paying for publication, which it is not. Gold open access is born open access. It's always open access from the start. Sometimes there's a cost associated with it. There's a really strong distinction between those, but there's this kind of appropriation of language. So we do need to be careful about language and be careful that what they think they're talking about is the same thing as what you think you're talking about. So yeah, sometimes that can get blurred. The last question up there. What do I think the public has started to do? Sorry, my hearing's not very good. Oh, as a target group, okay. What, for advocating for open access? Yeah, look, there's a lot of research into. Okay, so the question is, what do we think of the public being a target group for advocacy for open access? There's a lot of discussion about, well, I feel I'm trying to drive this discussion in some ways, about the sort of benefits beyond the academy of open access. Who's benefiting? Because if you look at the policies for Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for the Wellcome Trust, for the RCUK, and I'm pretty sure for HEPI as well, they all actually say we believe open access will benefit research and benefit society. This is kind of a belief thing, and I think that we're far enough into the beyond belief and looking at evidence really. But there isn't a huge amount of evidence to necessarily say. There is evidence to show that open access certainly does assist research, make research more efficient. But it's hard to gather the evidence for the public because, one, they're not organised in that way. It's like they don't have societies for people who benefit from open access. They just don't exist. And so it might be an individual, or it might be somebody who was able to find something out of it. A condition that they had, and therefore they were able to get better treatment, or somebody who was able to build better infrastructure in the sort of disaster-prone area so that the next time it flooded, everything didn't collapse, whatever. So those sorts of environments are very scattered, and they're not necessarily associating things with open access. So it's a bit tricky to actually kind of gather that evidence. So the public, if as a target for advocacy, it's very much a anecdotal gathering of information. But as we know, lots of anecdotes, multiple anecdotes don't make data. It's quite challenging. So I would say that from my point of view, while they are actually a beneficiary of open access, I'm not targeting them as a means to try and achieve it. But others may have other opinions. I'm conscious of lunch. Yeah, okay. Yeah, we're 10 minutes late. Sorry, guys. Thanks very much.